may provide a brief introduction about the topic, which is metrics to evaluate models. One thing you might be wondering is why is this an important aspect of IRPIC? To start off, I'd like to remind everybody that we are, as part of the modeling team, part of the environmental intelligence team that brings together the modeling, the observations, and the data together. And so that provides a motivation to look at it as part of IRPIC itself. And all of you are also aware that as part of modeling, we all need to go ahead and evaluate models. Right now, models are going to higher resolution. They are including more and more processes. And with all of that, I mean, with higher resolution models and more processes, everyone's compelled to do larger ensembles of simulations. And all this kind of brings in a lot of data. The data volume keeps increasing. So, I mean, even without that, it is important to evaluate the models. But as we go into this time frame of larger data, we need to think about systematic and efficient ways in which we can do model evaluation. And doing such things would help us integrate and synthesize our research so that it helps in new scientific discovery. It would highlight gaps in models, and so it would help model development. It would also, I mean, by doing a thorough model evaluation, you can also figure out what kind of observations are needed to probe the models when you don't have the sufficient data. So it kind of indicates gaps in observations. And so, Sarah, if you can go to the next slide. So today's presentations, I mean, what we're going to do is, what we are going to have is right now to start off with just two presentations, one today and one at the next IRPIC meeting. You know, and you'll see different ways and approaches that people have used and different groups have used to evaluate models. And so today, Forrest Hoffman and Nate Collier would talk about ILAMB. But into the future, if there is interest in this topic, we can probe further and try to advance the field, talk about what we can do to advance the field by looking at data mining algorithms or data assimilation techniques and so on. So as I indicated today, the focus will be on terrestrial model evaluation, and next week it'll be on land ice validation and verification. So it's two different approaches to evaluation, but it just touches individual components of the Earth system. Sarah, can we go to the next slide? So there, the relevant performance elements for that these topics and metrics address include ones on understanding processes. That's 9.2.3. 9.3.2 helps in model development, both in terms of global models, and 3.4 touches on performance elements for regional models. And so with that, I'd like to turn the floor over to Forrest Hoffman and Nate Collier, and you can take it away.
Thanks. Can you guys hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yes.
And Nate, you can share your screen now if you like.
Yeah, so I just wanted to follow on what Renu said about model evaluation. This is something that we've been working on for a number of years, but Nate's going to give us a nice overview of very recent developments that have resulted in an ILAMB package that we make available. It's fully open source and open developed. Nate will talk about that a little bit. And we're very interested in working with the data teams and other folks in IARPIC and through the agencies to add additional data sets and figure out new and better ways to confront our models with observations. So be thinking about that as Nate goes through here. You know, if you have some really nice data set, you think, wow, you know, this is a process that's not well constrained in these models. We'd really like to talk to you about how we can maybe employ that data to help us improve models going forward. So with that, I think, Nate, please take it away.
Okay. Well, thanks everybody for attending. I appreciate the interest. And today we're talking about some work that we've done to look at benchmarking land models out of Earth system models, but I'm going to try to present it kind of with a view to something that we could do more specific to the science goals and processes relevant to the Arctic. And so that'll kind of be the theme as we go throughout. Of course, no man is an island, and there's a big team of people behind all of this. Oops. Yeah. So, well, one thing is, at least if you're in our community, people throw around the ILAMB term quite a bit. And what we found is that it grows to be an ambiguous term or overloaded term. It stands for the International Land Model Benchmarking, effort, let's say. But when people use that word, they could be using it in a number of different senses. I mean, first of all, it could be the community. So what we've tried to do is engage a lot of the global group of modelers and scientists and the measurement community as well, and so that we can bring them all together and talk about how we can best constrain and measure and benchmark our models. Or, when you say ILAMB, you could also be talking about our data sets. So a lot of times observational data does not come into a format that's very convenient to confronting models with. And so we, as a community, have identified a collection of data sets that we find to be important, and we curate that collection, which is formatted for easy comparison with model outputs. But you could also be talking about the methods that we've developed. We have a paper right now under review which details a lot of that method. I'll have a link in the slides a little bit later for a preprint of that. But you could be talking about that, the technique, the approach, or you could just be talking about the software package itself. And so, as Forrest mentioned, we've written an open source Python package which you can just use straight up, but it's also written on purpose to be tailored by the community to suit their own science goals. And hopefully throughout this talk, you'll get a sense for how maybe that could be done. Or you could just be talking about ILAMB results. Also, as part of this talk, I'm going to demonstrate a set of results that were formulated over the Arctic, and you'll see people could be just talking about the results themselves, which have value in and of themselves. And so whenever we talk about ILAMB, almost inevitably we start with these kinds of plots. And if you've heard anything about it, most likely you've seen a plot like this at some point. And this is really just the beginning of it. But just to orient you really fast to what you're looking at, across the top, you'll see a number of models from the CMIP5 archive, a big model intercomparison project. And these are models from around the world. And on the left-hand side, you'll notice that every row corresponds to some model output from a land model. And you also notice that it's quite extensive, maybe not completely exhaustive, but we're looking at model performance on a wide dimension of what it outputs, not just handpicking a few things. And we're constantly, of course, looking also to change that. And what we try to expand on that. And so what we try to do is then, on the left panel there, you see a stoplight kind of color scheme. And the goal here is to assign an absolute score for how well a model performs with respect to a given variable. And there could be a number of data sets underneath that, which I'll expose in a moment. So the idea, though, is that we try to give you some score, but as you look, you may notice that a lot of the coloring schemes they're fairly similar, and so what we find more helpful sometimes is for any given variable to look at the relative score. And so on the right-hand panel, you'll notice like green and red colors, where green just means for any given variable, for that collection of models, your model is doing better than the others are in that particular score. And so this is helpful because it helps you kind of distinguish models, or it's kind of like a consumer reports, right? So you can see what maybe one model does better than another model, or you might perform well in one area, but that comes at a cost of something else in another area. And so this is kind of like the philosophy that we employ here when we try to gauge models. We want something really holistic to give you a snapshot of kind of the overall performance. And so, but we don't really believe that this kind of takes the place. It's not like a grade card or anything. This is more of like to aid the scientists to help hone in on what might be relevant differences or changes in models or model versions. So, when we start talking about the fact that we have these scores, and first thing that pops into your mind is, well, what's in the score? And so what's in the score is it's a composite of a lot of different aspects of model performance. So we score the bias that's normalized, as well as the centralized RMSE. We centralize it so that it kind of decouples it from the bias. Otherwise, you're double counting errors. We also look at how well do models capture the timing of the annual cycle, the maximum, as well as looking at aspects like interannual variability and spatial distribution. And then we blend it together where we double count this RMSE score, because we want, that's the, if you really are capturing the RMSE well, you really are capturing it all well. And so we want to more heavily weight that in the overall scoring. But of course, this is all customizable. And whereas I'm not jumping into details about how I'm computing these scores, we have a paper preprint that explains it all in gory detail. The point is that we're trying to look at wide aspects. So we want the overall score to reflect a relevant change when a relevant change happens. And because that aids the scientists then into digging down and trying to figure out, okay, why did that relevant change occur? But at this point, it's far easier to just show you than it is to try and explain you with words. And so what I've shown here on the bottom is a link that you can go to. It's live. We'll leave it up for a while as well so you can explore it. And I'll show it now on my screen. And what it's showing is it's showing the exact same kind of figures that I showed in the slides, but this is particular for 3 versions of CLM, CLM 4, 4.5, and 5. And for this particular call, what I've done is I've run the ILAMB methodology. We are mostly concerned in kind of global decadal scale of the biogeochemical cycle. But for this one, I've run it just over the Arctic region. So all the absolute scores and everything everything you're seeing here is performance relative to the Arctic, and you'll see that take place. You'll see that in more detail in a moment. But you notice the same kind of stoplight diagrams here on the left, as well as their relative counterparts on the right. But as I mentioned, this isn't the end all. What we hope is that this is going to motivate the scientists to want to explore why certain scores are the way that they are. And so you'll notice some tabs here at the top. If you click on the results table tab, it takes you to a numerical version of what I was just showing. Let's make the font maybe a little bigger. And what you'll see here is you can click any one of these rows, like maybe leaf area index, and it will expand, and it shows you the underlying data sets that are there. So in this case, we're looking at MODIS and AVHRR. And for each one of these scores, this is the score that the given model was assigned relative to the particular data set, and then we blend those together by these weights to form an overall score for how well a model performs in a given variable. And so some of these you'll see have kind of peculiar looking weights. And I'll have more to say on exactly how we're computing those weights. But suffice it to say that that's completely flexible to the user. He can just devise any kind of weighting scheme that he wants, and the default will be equally weighted. But then the main idea here is that you click on one of these dataset pages, and then it changes the view entirely. What it's showing you now is a very detailed representation of how well the particular models collection performed against that data set. And there's a little running header up here in case you get lost as you're looking through the page. You can look up here and remember that you're looking at the area index, and it shows you the time range, and the table of results here is clickable, and so it's context sensitive, and it's going to change all of the plots that I'll show you down below. And what you'll see here are mean values, things that modelers are all the time looking at. Look at biases and the RMSE and the phase shift in terms of months as well. And then you'll notice a colorized portion of that table. And that colorized portion shows you, and the far right-hand column shows you the overall score, and then the individual pieces show you the components that make up that overall score. And they're colorized so that you can easily see across models, which ones are greater and which ones are, are where the performance is degraded. So you can try to, when you look at your overall score, try to understand, well, what is the thing that has changed in this particular model? And then you can use that information then to dig in and try to figure out what it is. And so then if you just kind of scroll down here, you'll see that there are plots. And in this case, because I set the region to the Arctic, it rendered all the plots in terms of the Arctic. And this is without any kind of modification to the code. This is just how it works. So in developing something specific for the Arctic, we might play around with the aspect ratios of these plots, for example. This was just kind of the default behavior running the default ILAMB through an Arctic region. And those regions are also completely arbitrary, and you can provide them in terms of like a mask. So I know like the above region is of interest to that particular project. You can define a netcdf file that provides that as a mask, and then all the analysis and plots will be relative to that particular region. And as you scroll through here, you'll see that we're plotting the mean values over the time. Again, it's of the given model that you have selected at that time, and show you things like the bias as well as a map of the scores that we develop. In the RMSE, we look at interannual variability, and we're showing you also what was the average month where the maximum was realized for the benchmark data set, as well as for the models, and to give you some notion of a phase shift, how far ahead or behind your model may be. And then we score the seasonal cycle as well, and look at things like the spatial Taylor diagram showing how well distributed things are. And then you'll notice that all of this is kind of in a section labeled temporally integrated period mean. And you can just collapse that and look at things that are integrated over space. and what it will show you then are the kind of like the integrals over space. You can see what's happening to the signal, and then looking at the annual cycle, as well as provide you a plot with all the annual cycles on them as once. And so we envision this as kind of a way where if you wanted to dig into one particular model and really try to understand something about why your model is performing the way it is, it gives you that capability. But then in addition to this, we have this All Models tab here, because sometimes what you really want to do is you want to look at one particular plot across all the models. Yeah, zoom out a little. And so you can come here and select the plot type, and then it will show you all the plots there, and they're all on the same axes as well. So then you can try to infer something about why things may have changed, or meaningful differences that you can possibly see. And so all the plots that you saw there, you can come up and take a look and see how they compare across the series of things that we're looking at. And then, so one problem that we've had, and question that we get often, is that these kinds of scalars, these period mean values and the biases and whatnot, a lot of modeling centers, they will tune their models using sometimes some of the data sets that we have, and they tune to those parameters. And so, to get a better ILAMB score is merely the fact that you use these data sets to tune, that would seem not fair. And so, in an attempt to address that, we also look at something we label here as relationships. And in this case, we only have one of them for LAI, but what we do is we can take the LAI product that we have, say, and then we can compare it versus an arbitrary number of driver variables that we want to look at. In this case, we're only looking at precip, and we're using the GPCP2 product. But it's arbitrary. You can set this up to be any number of independent variables you want to compare against. And then I can look at a two-dimensional kind of distribution of those points and compare that to the same thing that we get out of the models. And so what you would hope then is that you not only are getting the right that you're not only getting the right scalars, but that you're also kind of getting this underlying process correct. And so this shows the two distributions as well as the difference where it's high and where it's low. But we also provide these kind of curved diagrams to show you what the mean functional curve is, and we score the difference between those two to give you an idea of how well you may be capturing the underlying mechanism. And so we hope that this is a way that we can drive models to be more mechanistic, and that we can catch, if they're getting the right answer because they're tuned or because they truly are representing that process in a more mechanistic way. So if you return back here to the top level page, you notice that we've started to add some variables that are relevant to more Arctic regions in and of themselves. One of them is permafrost. So we're using the NSIDC map of discontinuous and continuous permafrost. And in this case, what we're looking at here is we just plot the extent. We're comparing the extent, not necessarily where it's discontinuous and continuous. So on the left-hand side, you see the extent. And then here in the middle plot, this is the extent that we get from the model. And this extent from the model is based on the soil temperature, which is a technique. So, the model only needs to have soil temperature, and ILAMB software will compute this extent under the hood based on, some methodology that we refer to in the documentation for that. And then what we do is we start taking a look at where did the model have permafrost that the benchmark didn't, and vice versa, and where do they share? And so then we can score, how much area you missed and how much excess area that you have to develop an overall score, and show you plots of where that happens. And so we are looking to put specific data sets in here which are of interest to the high latitudes. You can also come in here and look at just the bias across models. Incidentally, here you see a red area around the coastlines, and this is because of a difference in representation of land, and we've since fixed that problem, but apparently I didn't rerun the results with the fix in there. But we've kind of taken care now that we no longer penalize you if you miss permafrosted area because you thought that particular place was ocean.
Are you streaming?
Pardon? Can you say that again?
No, I was.
Mark, you're breaking up.
Mark,
Yeah.
you're breaking up. We're not hearing you well. You want to put your question?
No, I know. I'll turn this.
Thanks.
But while there's a pause,
Good.
let me ask,
I'm going to turn my
At some
video off.
will you address point measurements for validation versus gridded results? I noticed most of these are gridded data sets that you're using for evaluation. But when it comes to permafrost, I'm thinking of the GTMP network where you get actual like after layer depth. Whereas it seems like if you're going on surface temperature, you're just getting unless you've got a whole land surface model. You're just getting the frozen surface and not the active layer depth.
Right. So we would like to incorporate more. This is a start, right? Like we certainly can accept those kinds of data sets. So if you look in some of the data sets are globally gridded, like the ones I've shown so far, but we do also look at, site-based data, like these are FluxNet sites, the ones that are restricted there to the northern high latitudes. And so if you had a collection of those data sites, if you have a collection of data that measures the active layer thickness, and that's something that we can estimate out of models, then we can incorporate site level data in as well.
Thanks.
Yeah. So was Mark able to?
I think he was going to enter his question in the chat box.
Oh, okay. I probably need
but it's not there yet.
Okay. Well, yeah, and so we also have a snow water equivalent that we're looking into. And currently it's kind of, we're having to rethink this one a little bit, but it is there. And what we did was we just kind of applied our regular methodology to some data that we have for snow water equivalent. But what we've seen here is in CLM 5, there is a parameter that limits the amount of snow depth that you can have. And from CLM 4.5 to 5, they changed that parameter to 10 meters. And so what we get is kind of not very helpful. And so we're trying to rethink this one a little bit and try to put it so that the output that we see is a little more helpful. But I guess what the point for ARPIC is that we are looking at putting more high latitude relevant data in, and we are interested in putting more of that into the package as well. So one question then may be, well, how do you treat the different kinds of data? Because you could have data that is measured at sites, or you could have data that was remote sensed, or you could have kind of reanalysis that's been gridded. And so what do we do with all of that? And what we do with that is we merge them together with these weights, and these, but I haven't really said yet how those weights come about. And so for that, I'll go back to the slides for a minute. And the way that we've done this is, of course, it's a bit subjective, but we've tried to be a bit more objective in defining a rubric. And so what the approach that we took was, we're going to build a weight for a given data set, and it's going to be based on things like, well, how certain are we of that data? And most of the data that we have has no real given uncertainty. Very, very few data sets that we have provide us with that. But we can still quantify the certainty in terms of the methodology. Is the methodology, if it's a reanalysis product, is that methodology published? Is it well accepted in the community? Is it distinguished in the community? Does it actually have qualitative uncertainty? And so we can assign this weight to a data set based on that certainty. And then we also apply a weight to a data set multiplicatively based on how appropriate the scale and coverage is. I mean, given that ILAMB was meant to look originally at biogeochemical cycles over decadal type scales around the globe, then we have a weighting scheme that weights more heavily the more global and time coverage that you have. Of course, if you wanted to do this for the Arctic, you could devise your own weighting rubric based on anything that the community comes together and says that this is a good idea. And then we have a third weighting, and this weighting goes not for a data set, but for the whole variable. And the reason for this is, you may have things that you want to include in your comparison, but aren't the most important part of your entire process. So when we're looking at the carbon cycle, there are certain variables that are more interesting than others, but we need to include things like precipitation and radiation because it tells the whole story about what's going on with the particular variable. So this allows us to kind of weight more lightly these areas so that in the overall score that we get, the overall score, the single number score, the effects of the thing that you want to study are more heavily weighted. And so I just wanted to end here with some concluding remarks about the system. I know it's really just a taste, but I feel like my job is really just to kind of show you what's out there and what's possible. And what ILAMB does, it provides a consistent and systematic comparison of model output. So the website that you're looking at right there is auto-generated by our Python software framework. And it's systematic so that it's the same thing every time. To get your data set into ILAMB, is to provide it for models for comparison, and in a systematic way. But of course, it's only as good as the community assembled collection of observational data sets. And so the ILAMB team has worked hard to identify those data sets that are high quality for the science goals that we have. But it would be, I think that it would be good for this community and maybe others as well to talk about, well, what kinds of data sets, what kinds of comparisons would be important, for the science goal of putting together something that's Arctic focused. And I mean, the system scores models, but I would encourage you not to get too caught up in that. It's not a report card. It's not something that says your model is good or your model is bad. But really the idea is that it's an indicator of differences and changes. And the point is rather that it also organizes the results. So we're not just computing a bunch of plots that are organized by plot and hard to parse unless you know the exact plot that you want to go and look at. But it helps you locate, the relevant plot, because we render thousands of plots. Oh, I see somebody's chatting now. Okay, you'll have to excuse me while I try to figure out how I'm supposed to see that chat.
So I can read it to you. The first is permafrost observational data sets are available at the Arctic, at GTNP Arctic portal. And then somebody else responded that we did site-based intercomparison with ILAMB and works with GTNP type data as well.
Oh, great. Okay, thank you. Yeah, so maybe those are things that we need to be more aware of, other things that we can include also in the default package.
So Mark Stieglitz did ask, it said, this is great. Where can we find the data and software?
Okay, that's great. So the implementation is open source. I'll come back to this slide in a second. At the very end here, you can go and I included some links here at the end. And the first one there is the Bitbucket repository, to where you can go and look at the documentation. Sorry. Yeah, so that'll take you to this page. This is where the source is, and there's a little bit here in kind of a welcome, but you'll notice there's also a link to documentation, and I think that server, okay, is up. And if you look at the tutorials section, we have a whole lot of things there that go through like installation. There's a sample data set that you can download just to get running. It has some sample model data and sample observations. There is a tool that we build in when you install this PyCon package called ILAMB Fetch, which goes and looks at all of the local ILAMB data that you may have and compares it with SHA-1 file of something we have remotely, and will automatically download files that are missing or out of date, so you can stay up to date with the most thing that we have with one command line. You don't have to go download 60 data sets yourself. And there's tutorials here as well as about how you add a benchmark data set and how you format them, because ILAMB is built to understand the CF convention of netcdf data files. We don't require that you have all of it. We try not to be pedantic about it, but especially the dimensional information, ILAMB looks at your benchmark data set, the netcdf dimensional information, and pulls out of the model something that is as comparable as I can make it. So it does a lot of intelligence built into that system underneath to make that happen. And then it also will go through and show you how you can change the analysis options or define your own custom regions. So that there's a good bit that's already written in the tutorials, and I'd be happy to help you with anything beyond that as well. And then we also have this paper preprint. Hopefully this paper will come out shortly. Oh, I remember, I wanted to show you and then this is the link to the results that I just showed if you want to peruse those on your own. So, the system is ready to accept and incorporate new data sets. And it also can run on regional models. The ILAMB is smart enough to detect whether or not you have a regional model, and it will restrict all the other models that you have in the collection that you're trying to run against to the same domain. So if you have some global model output as well as your regional model output, it will automatically restrict the solution to the shared domain and show you the results over both domains, over both models in the same domain. And a lot of the methodology, you might look at that and say, oh, but I'd like to do this or that, or maybe you can think of the methodology that we have thus far as an initial suggestion, really, and it can be adapted to meet your own science goals. We're not trying to tell you how to benchmark. We're trying to make it easier for you to do so, and to do so systematically by building a system that can accept those data sets. So I could keep talking, but maybe it's good enough and better just to listen to any kind of questions that you guys have.
This is Phil Rash, and I've got a question for you.
Yes,
I'm interested also in, do you have some kind of an automated remapping software so that if we produce model output at a different resolution from the observations or vice versa, or different map projections are mapped naturally, or do we need to do that before we deposit the data sets in the repository?
So the answer is it depends, which is unsatisfying. So let me be more clear. The ILAMB system is really built thinking about CMIP, the CMIP5 archive, and so we're working with things on regular lat-long grids. The resolution differences we handle internally. So if you have a regular lat-long grid, your output in a regular lat-long grid, then I handle those resolution differences internally and without interpolation error. And you can look in the paper for more details, but it's essentially by making a composite grid that shares the cell breaks of both source and target, and then interpolates that to both grids so there's no loss of information, and then compares on that new grid. But if you're looking at things like in different projections and whatnot, then I do provide some naive interpolation, but conservative remapping is kind of a monster in and of itself, and I did not want to try to subsume that into the software. So we encourage users, if they have things on non-regular grids, that you do a conservative remapping yourself before you map it. This is something that we could build into it, but everybody has their own favorite method and own favorite software, and I'm sensitive to building that into my software that would make users install it, if they didn't want it, so I'm trying to keep ILAMB as clean as possible. Does that answer you or make sense?
Yeah, thanks. That was good. Can I ask, does the data have to be Seymorized, or do you accept it, kind of in the raw model output formats? Also?
Yeah, well, I guess that depends on what you mean by raw model output formats, but oh no, I remember. So I did have here up on my terminal window, let me just make it bigger, maybe. So this is the header of one of the gridded products we have for radiation. And so when I say we're CF compliant, but we don't have to be, I'm not going to complain if you don't have a standard name or something like that. Mm-hmm. Essentially what ILAMB is really interested in is the variable of the particular file. So in this case, it's RSUS, and I can show you where that's defined later, but And then this dimensional information. For the dimensional information, I want the time, of course, and the time needs to have units on it and give me a calendar. But I don't care, you know, for example, that you specify the axis, the long name, or the standard name. But it is very important that you give me the bounds arrays, which are sometimes given and sometimes not, I find. But a lot of times what data really constitutes are mean values across time intervals and lat and long intervals. And so, especially with calendar differences and differences in datum, it is really complicated to try to match up data if you don't tell me, you know, the beginning and ending time of that interval, because the time itself is badly defined, right? It could be the middle of the interval. Some people make it at the end of the interval, some at the beginning. And so it's really hard for me to assume and then try to make that match up with, you know, what I find in observation. So there's a bit of it that is important, you know, to have, but what I would say by that is, like, it doesn't have to be crazy. And you can name the variables anything that you want to name them. So this is a sample data set. Oh, me. And this is a sample configure file. So this is what the ILAMB system is built to parse. So there's some tags in here for headers. In this case, we're looking at radiation and energy cycle. And this is the particular variable that we're looking at right now. And you'll notice here then that I give it this tag variable. So I don't care what you call the variable, but whenever ILAMB goes and looks in this data file for a variable, it's going to look for this RSUS. And so they don't need to be Seymorized in the sense they have to follow all of the naming conventions. I mean, that's annoying for you. I mean, it's important for the CMIP process, but that's annoying for the user. So this allows you to call it whatever that you want, and then that is what, in a given data set, that I'm going to look for. And so adding a data set, if it's formatted properly, is as simple as giving me a pointer to where that source is. Does this make sense?
Yeah, it does. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
And so we also,
Nate, there are also 2 comments on the group chat.
oh, okay.
Can you take a look? One is ILAMB aware of IASOA?
IASOA. I don't know what IASOA is.
Mm-hmm.
It's an atmospheric data set. Siri, Yoda, do you want to jump in on that? It's
so it's a conglomeration of an affiliation of all the field sites, the research field sites in the Arctic, you know, run by various countries and various projects, you know, often co-located with you know, like other permanent stations. But the point is, they try to coordinate to get their data in a common format so it can be used for model comparison of atmosphere, obviously, but sometimes there's surface data as well. I'm just saying it represents data sets that would be good for model comparison. They've got a special effort right now to try and to coordinate with the Year of Polar Prediction in producing harmonized data sets for comparison with models. So I put a link in there to their website.
Thank you. Yeah.
Want to know more.
Well, and it could be that somebody on the team is aware of that, and I'm just not. But I appreciate the pointer. Be good to check out. And was there another one that there was another comment? I don't see where to pull up the chat, so I'm not able to look at it myself.
So there's one by, it's a comment by Elaine Matthews. It's regarding evaluating benchmark data sets, criteria like whether data sets are recognized or used by the modeling community may be strengthened by getting expertise about specific data other than from model users. So essentially going back to the data uses would be useful. It's a comment. So,
Okay.
do you? I mean, how does ILAMB deal with that?
I don't know if I follow you entirely. How does it deal with what?
Can I,
Go
can
ahead.
I add?
Yeah.
My question was, there's probably more information in the paper, but you commented about a few kinds of things that might be used to evaluate and score data sets, the benchmarks.
Oh, yeah.
And my question was that, I mean, modelers may use lots and lots of data sets, but there may be some expertise about specific data set types, like, I mean, I'm thinking of methane or wetlands. And I'm wondering if there's a way to include not just modeler evaluations, but also evaluations from people who may be somewhat expert in a particular variable, but maybe not using it in an Earth system model.
Yeah, that's true. So the way that, I mean, Boris can speak up here too, but I think what we've tried to do is to engage these people in the process, right? So that what we have represents and encompasses their expertise as well. That a lot of times when you think about benchmarking models, you think about talking to modelers, but it's really important to have everybody as part of that conversation, because we may not be aware of deficiencies in the data. We just use it, right? Or limitations of the data. So it's really important to have the people who understand those aspects. Does that kind of get at what you're asking?
Yes, exactly. Thank you.
Yeah, so oh yeah, go.
This is Dave Lawrence, and just want to follow up on that. In NCAR, we have this project called the Climate Data Guide, mostly focused on climate data in the title, and we actually have each data set includes links to it, includes a qualitative description by scientists who are familiar with the quality of the data, describing, you know, what it's best used for, what its strengths and limitations are. So you can envision that we could do something like this that could then be, you know, updated through time as we learn new things about the data sets. Because Elaine's absolutely right. You know, the people involved do not necessarily have the expertise to evaluate each data set independently.
Yeah.
Then, Helen, are you there? Do you want to ask your question?
Yes, sorry if I was not clear enough. I was wondering, as a modeler, if ILAND could be used not only to do model comparison with whether field or remotely sensed observations, but also to add a given model, to compare a given model to other models that have already used ILAND. For instance, the CMIP5 model.
Yeah. So I would say, first of all, that our focus has been to compare always versus observations. So everything that we show you is versus observations. But, you know, the configure, it's not, let's say, it's not a feature that we have developed a whole lot, like the ability to have a collection of models and just give it a flag so that it overrides the observations and uses a particular model as a reference instead. But you could do this yourself by building up a configure file where, you know, the pointer to this observation, you know, this points to some observational file, but it could just as easily point to a file that comes from a model. So it's a matter of really just doing the legwork. And in fact, I think the ocean folk at INCAR have been doing this. They've been building up their own configure files where they're pointing to particular model runs because they want to see how well that they run versus those other ones. So it's a little more legwork for you, the user, because we haven't designed the software to do that easily yet. Because it's just not our focus, but it definitely can be done.
Right. Thank you very much. And thank you for your presentation. It was great.
Thanks.
There are a few more comments, but we've reached 4 o'clock. If people have time, we can continue on, or at the next meeting, we will introduce the other co-lead, Richard Kalata, who has right now called in, but we've kind of reached the end of this particular meeting. Thank you very much, Nate, for your presentation. I would recommend that since there's a lot of interest in this, people can go ahead and tag the presentation and ask questions, and you can have a conversation going in IRPIC. And Sarah, do you want to quickly explain that so that we can have that going? And just before Sarah explains that, I also want to point out the next meeting would focus on land ice model, land ice validation and verification. And if others have other ideas for presentations on this particular theme and you'd like to have it going, please do point it out on the IRPIC website. So Sarah?
Yeah, so thanks for adding that great presentation today. And clearly there's a lot of interest in this. I've tried to capture the notes that have come in because there's been at least 5 or 6 data sets that have been put into the chat box. So those will be included in the notes. But Renu, as Renu noted, if you just go to Nate's presentation, which will appear on your homepage, and if you don't find it that way, type in his name in the search box, and it will come up that way. And you can add your data sets, any information you want, any questions you have, and those will be forwarded on to Nate, and then he can respond. And this will just keep a running tab of everybody's. So you can see my first comment is right here. Thanks for uploading your presentation. And it will just keep a running thing so everybody can share all of the information that was shared in the chat box publicly.
Thank you, Sarah.